Are any of you considering joining the Defence Forces? Anyone here?
No.
So well then, you've probably never considered the psychological effects that you may experience if you were deployed to war. Today, I'll be talking about the psychological effects on the soldiers in these 4 texts. The Man He Killed, written by Thomas Hardy, American Sniper by Clint Eastwood, Full Metal Jacket, directed by Stanley Kubrick, and Suicide in the Trenches by Siegfried Sassoon. All these texts talk about the experiences of the soldiers during their experiences at war. And a common theme between them is just the psychological trauma which they experience. The Man He Killed by Thomas Hardy is written in 1902 at the time of the Second Boer War. The poem describes a face-to-face encounter between 2 enemies, and it describes the man's emotions as he deals with this confrontation. I shot at him as he at me. And then we quickly learn after that he killed him in his place. The poem then describes as the main character questions his actions, as he describes how you shoot a fellow down, you treat if met where any bars. This language of you shoot a fellow down, you treat if met where any bars shows how these soldiers weren't very different. They didn't want to be killing each other. They were just young men following orders. So here I've got a couple of examples of other situations in the war when the young men have not wanted to kill each other. This example here is a respect to Mehmetçik monument at the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, where a Turkish soldier carried back an Australian officer after he became injured and carried him back to his line. This is another example of men at war not wanting to fight, just doing it because they have to. This one here is a classic image of a famous situation on Christmas in 1914, where the young men had a temporary truce, and they came out and played football, exchanged Christmas wishes and all. So this young man at war who killed a young soldier is questioning these actions and the motive behind it. There were so many deaths in World War I, and he felt guilty for having done this, and he's going to have to live with it for the rest of his life. This theme of guilt experienced by this young man is also experienced by Chris Kyle in American Sniper. American Sniper covers the story of Chris Kyle, the most deadly sniper in US military history. We're first introduced to Kyle as an average American who, after witnessing the bombings of the US Embassy, is led to join the US Army. He becomes the most successful sniper in history, and throughout the film is portrayed as just being at one with his gun. The gun becomes an extension of his body as he becomes this killer with over 160 credited kills. This has a psychological effect on Kyle, as we learn when he returns home with a meeting with his psychologist, that the thing that haunts him is all the guys he couldn't save. Chris also feels guilt from war, not because of the men he killed, but because of the men like him who he couldn't save. So Chris's psychological trauma is also shown when he's back at home. Clint Eastwood does a nice panning shot starting with Chris sitting on the couch, slowly turning towards the TV. As he does this, we hear like the noises, the explosions, the gunfire. We're led to believe that the TV's on and he's watching it. But when the TV finally appears in the shot, we realise that it isn't on, and that's just the trauma still going on in Chris's head. So this guilt experienced by, 20% of Iraqi war veterans suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, according to the US Department of Veteran Affairs. This is a ridiculously high number of veterans suffering, and this suffering can go on for years and even decades after they return home. So this theme of guilt, experienced by the man and the man he killed, and Chris Kyle, they both experience this guilt. Oh, so this psychological change in Chris throughout his four tours in Iraq is also a psychological trauma seen in Full Metal Jacket. In Full Metal Jacket, we witness the changing of young men as they go through their basic training to becoming these cold-hearted killers who are deployed in Vietnam. This is kind of symbolized on the helmet worn by Private Joker, with a big "Born to Kill" written on the front, with a peace emblem just behind it. These men, they aren't killers. They're just young men living life who have gotten signed up to this lottery, whether they've done it themselves. But the training they got undertake turns them into these born to kill young men who are just killers. Private Pyle is a very undisciplined cadet who, through his lack of discipline, results in his peers being punished for his actions. In return, his peers beat him with bars of soap during his sleep. This treatment changes Private Pyle, as we see in this photo. He's not the same man as when he arrived. Like Chris, the psychological trauma he's experienced just through war, not even deployment, is clear and evident. Private Pyle is treated horribly by the drill sergeant. "You're so ugly you could be a modern art masterpiece." It's just one of the many insults that he is constantly given. He is led to suicide at the end after murdering his drill instructor. Full Metal Jacket, Suicide in the Trenches, is a sad poem revealing how cruel war is. Written by Siegfried Sassoon in World War I, it tells the story of a young man. The poem begins by introducing a simple and pleasant young man who we cannot help but imagine as a carefree, easygoing and happy young man. The poem starts with, "I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark and whistled early with the lark." This just shows how much of a carefree young man he was. And the lark symbolizes the morning. It's a bird that's a beautiful singer, and it just represents happiness. Through the grueling conditions in the trenches, we see a transformation as the next stanza quickly changes. With crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. Like Private Pyle, this young man was driven to commit suicide. He could not handle it. Both these men were led to sign up to the army through like propaganda and stuff like that. They weren't cut out for it because they couldn't handle it. They ended up committing suicide. The empty space around the mirror symbolizes the soldier's return to society. The mental and psychological trauma can leave them with nothing. They've experienced so much during war that men can't handle. And it just leaves them with nothing when they turn back. They can't fit back into society, they can't sustain jobs. They struggle to make friends again. And it's common among far too many veterans. The mirror in the middle is to make the reader question themselves. When you look at it, it makes you question, what is your view on war? You see all these men who suffer from psychological trauma, and it makes you question yourself, is that alright that these men go through this? Does an order from a general make it alright to kill other men? Do any of you think it is?
No.
Could any of you live with the guilt of killing someone?
No.
Does serving for your country make the possible risk of psychological trauma worth it?
No.
So overall, these four texts give out a strong anti-war message. They show the psychological trauma which isn't shown much through the media. Often destruction of war, the deaths, the destruction of the country themselves are shown, but psychological trauma experienced by the soldiers who are lucky enough to come home is often just not shown and not talked about enough. Do any of you have any comments?
Funnily enough, these are exactly the same questions we were asking today with the Year 9 class, is, what's the psychological cost of combat, and where does the combat end? It starts physically at war, but it continues for a long time afterwards, which is an internalised conflict, doesn't it?
Yep. With the amount of suicides of the veterans who come back, it's just war is ongoing and it can ruin your whole life. It can be shown as like glory and you're a good man for serving for your country, but it doesn't show that the downsides of being left psychologically traumatized for the rest of your life.
It seems a high price to pay for glory, doesn't it?
It's definitely a high price to pay. It's these orders from the men who don't have to serve, sending these young men to do these horrific things. They're the ones who have to live with it, not the people who send the orders.
So who should be looking in the mirror?
Anyone who wants to look at the poster, they can look in the mirror and they can see that the transformation in these young men from the innocent people to the killers, the ones committing suicide, the ones living with the guilt for the rest of their life, and they look at it and they can question themselves like, is that alright? Is that really what it's meant to be? And just emptiness again is just symbolises, the men who come back with nothing. They come back devastated, they can't fit back into jobs. After the Vietnam War, many of the veterans weren't, they struggled to find jobs again because of how horrifically they were portrayed through the media.
Yeah.